The valley was silent that morning, covered in a thin sheet of white snow that sparkled under the pale sun. Smoke rose gently from the chimney of a small wooden cabin hidden between the pine trees. Inside, Ethan Cole sat at a wooden table, his sleeves rolled up, a pen in his hand, and a thick folder spread open before him. Across from him sat a man in a gray suit, tall and calm, his expression sharp and focused. This was Mr. Langford, the state attorney general, one of the most powerful men in the state, yet in that small cabin, he looked more like a friend than a politician. Ethan had built this place with his own hands after leaving the city behind, far away from noise, lies, and endless HOA meetings that never led to peace. He'd come here for silence, for air that smelled like pine and freedom. But now, silence was the last thing he had. The cabin was filled with tension, the kind that made every tick of the clock sound loud. "You're sure this is everything?" Langford asked, his voice low but steady. Ethan nodded. "Every letter, every bank transfer, every fake citation they sent," he replied, pushing the folder across the table. "They've been extorting people for years under the name of community maintenance. They call it dues, but it's theft." Langford opened the folder and began to read, his eyes narrowing at each page. "These are serious crimes," he said, "and the fact that they're coordinated between multiple HOAs makes it worse. If this is true, we're looking at organized racketeering under state law." Ethan leaned back, the wooden chair creaking softly. "It's true," he said simply. "I've lived it." Outside, snow fell steadily, wrapping the valley in a hush so deep that even the wind sounded distant. Ethan had built this cabin far from everyone for this exact reason. To meet in private, no interference, no eavesdropping, no interruptions. But peace never lasted long when someone like Karen was nearby. She was the president of the Valley Creek HOA, a woman with a voice that carried across property lines and a temper sharp enough to cut through steel. She believed her rules stretched beyond her neighborhood, that everything in the valley belonged to her control, including land that wasn't hers. She had been after Ethan for months, sending him warnings, notices, and letters claiming his cabin violated community zoning. Each one he ignored, because his land was state-owned, not part of any HOA. But Karen didn't take silence as an answer. She took it as defiance, and today, she had come for a fight. Inside, Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee, the aroma filling the warm room. Langford looked up from the documents. "You've done a good job collecting all this," he said. "Once we process it, we can begin formal charges, but we'll need more witnesses, people willing to speak out." Ethan nodded. "They're afraid," he said quietly. "Karen threatens to fine them. Some she's already sued. Others she's shamed in front of neighbors." Langford sighed. "Fear is her weapon, but truth will break it." Before Ethan could reply, a sound cut through the calm. A car door slamming outside, followed by the crunch of footsteps on frozen snow. Ethan's brow furrowed. "No one should be here," he said. Both men turned toward the window. Through the frosted glass they saw a bright red SUV pulling up near the fence, a familiar one, and before either could move, heavy knocking echoed through the cabin door. 3 sharp hits that made the walls shake slightly. "Ethan Cole!" A woman's voice shouted from outside. "This is Valley Creek HOA business. You're in violation of zoning rules." Langford looked at him with a calm but curious expression. "Friend of yours?" he asked dryly. Ethan groaned softly. "More like my biggest problem," he muttered, walking toward the door. When he opened it, cold air rushed in along with the scent of snow, and there she was, standing in her thick red coat, sunglasses covering half her face even though the sun was dim, clipboard in one hand, a self-important look in the other. Karen Phillips, president of Valley Creek HOA, self-appointed queen of the valley. "Good morning," Ethan said, his tone polite but firm. "You're trespassing." She ignored him completely and marched closer, her boots crunching against the porch wood. "I have received multiple reports of an unapproved structure within HOA jurisdiction," she declared, waving her clipboard like a badge. "You're violating community zoning and scenic ordinances." Ethan crossed his arms. "Karen, this land isn't part of your HOA. I've told you that before," she smirked. "You can't just decide that. This entire valley falls under scenic preservation, and that includes your little cabin here, which, by the way, looks very unapproved." Ethan's patience thinned. "This is private land, registered under state protection," he said evenly, but she laughed. "That's what they all say, until they get their first fine." Her voice was loud, meant to echo, meant to sound like power, but before she could take another step, another voice spoke from behind Ethan, calm and commanding. "That's enough." Karen stopped mid-sentence, her head snapping toward the sound. The man in the gray suit had stepped forward into the light. His eyes steady, his presence almost overwhelming. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to sound brave. He held her gaze for a moment before speaking. "I'm Attorney General Langford, and you're currently interfering in a state investigation." The words hung in the air like thunder. Karen blinked, her confidence cracking. "The Attorney General?" she stammered, her face losing color. That's impossible. What investigation?" Langford stepped closer, his tone even colder now. "The one about HOA corruption, property intimidation, and illegal zoning expansions," he said. "You might have heard of it." For the first time in her life, Karen had nothing to say. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. The clipboard in her hand trembled slightly. Ethan stood beside the door watching her reaction with quiet satisfaction. "Told you it was private land?" he said calmly. Karen's voice returned but weaker now. "You can't just show up and accuse me of things. I'm the president of Valley Creek HOA. I enforce community standards." Langford raised an eyebrow. "And who enforces them on you?" he asked, stepping past her onto the porch, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. "Because from where I stand, your HOA's authority ends where this fence begins." Karen's jaw clenched, her pride trying to hold on. "I have rights," she snapped. "I have jurisdiction over this area." Langford's voice didn't rise. It only grew colder. "Not anymore," he said. "Your jurisdiction has just become a legal matter of interest for my office." She stepped back, snow crunching under her heel, her anger twisting into nervous laughter. "You can't do this," she said shakily. "I'll have your office investigated." You'll do nothing," Langford interrupted, "except answer questions when my investigators arrive." The valley was silent again except for the faint whistle of the wind. Karen stood there frozen, her confidence shattered, the snow still falling around her. Ethan folded his arms, watching her quietly. There was no shouting now, no orders, no arrogance, only shock written on her face. Finally, Langford turned to Ethan and said, "Let's continue inside, Mr. Cole. We have a lot more to discuss." Then he looked back at Karen. "Mrs. Phillips, I suggest you leave before you add trespassing to your list of charges." She blinked, realizing for the first time how deep she was standing in trouble. Her voice barely a whisper now. "Charges?" Langford nodded once. "You'll find out soon enough." She stumbled back, muttering something under her breath before turning sharply and heading toward her SUV. The tires spun against the snow as she drove off fast, the red taillights vanishing between the trees. Inside the cabin the fire crackled quietly again as Ethan and Langford returned to the table. The thick folder still open, filled with names, documents, and numbers that were about to change everything. Langford looked up at him and said softly, "That woman just gave us more evidence than any document could." Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "She never knows when to stop talking." Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the tire tracks that led away from the cabin, erasing every trace of the encounter. But inside, two men sat across the table knowing the fight that had started in that small wooden cabin would soon spread far beyond the valley. And this time, the law would be on their side. The next morning the valley was quiet but heavy, the kind of silence that follows trouble, as if the snow itself was waiting for something to happen. Ethan sat at his table again with the same folder open, coffee steaming beside him, the fireplace crackling softly in the background. But his mind was restless. Last night's encounter with Karen had replayed in his head again and again. The shock on her face when she realized who was sitting inside his cabin still made him smirk, but deep down, he knew people like her never stopped. They regrouped, they planned, and they came back harder. Langford had left early that morning to meet his team in town, promising to return later that day with official documents and warrants. Ethan had barely finished cleaning the mugs when the sound of tires on gravel echoed outside again. His heart sank. He walked to the window and pulled the curtain slightly. A white SUV this time, cleaner, newer, and when the doors opened, Out stepped Karen in a fur coat with two men beside her. One holding a camera, the other carrying a stack of folders. She was back. And this time she'd brought backup. Ethan sighed, muttering under his breath. She really doesn't know when to stop. He opened the door before she could knock, the cold air cutting through the warmth of the cabin. "You again?" he said. His voice tired but controlled. She smiled too sweetly, her fake charm sharp as a blade. "Good morning, Mr. Cole. I just wanted to clear up yesterday's misunderstanding," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I may have overstepped, but I'm here officially now." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Officially?" he asked. "You mean trespassing with a camera crew this time?" She ignored the jab and motioned to the man with the folders. "This is Mr. Dwyer, our HOA compliance officer, and that's Mr. Harris, community documentation representative." Ethan's patience was already wearing thin. "You brought your own photographer to harass me?" he asked. Karen laughed lightly. "Documentation," she said. "For our records, you see, when homeowners break rules, we record the violations for future hearings." Ethan stepped onto the porch, his breath fogging in the cold. "This isn't your community," he said slowly, emphasizing each word. "You have no hearing, no authority, and no right to even be standing here." Karen's smile tightened, her eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that," she said, then handed him a sheet of paper. "This is your official violation notice. Unapproved construction, unauthorized use of natural resources, and failure to register your structure with the HOA board." Ethan glanced at it and handed it right back. "I told you yesterday. I'm not part of your HOA. Your rules don't apply here." She smirked again. "Every landowner in this valley benefits from our community upkeep. Road maintenance, snow removal, scenic protection. You don't get to opt out of shared responsibility." Ethan looked past her toward the men, one filming quietly, his camera lens aimed at Ethan's face. "Turn that off," he said sharply. But the man didn't move. Karen crossed her arms. "You're on community property," she said. "You can't order us around." Before Ethan could reply, a car engine hummed in the distance, and then the crunch of new tires joined the noise. All heads turned as a black state vehicle pulled up behind Karen's SUV. The door opened and out stepped Mr. Langford, calm as ever, holding a folder under his arm. His presence immediately shifted the air. Karen's fake smile vanished, her eyes widened in disbelief. "You again?" she hissed. Langford walked forward, snow crunching under his shoes. "I told you yesterday to stay off this property, Mrs. Phillips." His tone was cold and steady. "So you decided to come back with an audience?" Karen regained her composure quickly, forcing confidence she didn't have. "I'm here on official business," she snapped. "We're documenting zoning violations." Langford stopped inches away from her, his expression unreadable. "Zoning violations?" he repeated quietly. "You do realize this land doesn't fall under your jurisdiction, correct?" She crossed her arms. "That's what he claims. But we've already filed for scenic control expansion." Langford raised an eyebrow. "Filed with who?" he asked. She hesitated. "The county," she said quickly. "It's pending approval." Langford's voice stayed calm, but his eyes darkened. "I spoke with the county this morning," he said. "No such filing exists, and your HOA isn't authorized to expand its boundaries without state consent, which you don't have." Her face flushed, her breath quickening. "You're lying," she said. "We've done everything legally." Langford stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If that's true, why are your records missing signatures from 3 property owners, including Mr. Cole here?" Karen froze, her eyes darting away for a split second. "And that was enough," Langford continued. "You've been using intimidation to control residents, overcharging for maintenance that never happens, and threatening people with foreclosure. You call that legal?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out, her bravado fading as the camera behind her kept rolling, catching every second of her trembling expression. Ethan folded his arms. "Go ahead. Keep filming," he said. "The whole county's about to see who you really are." The man with the camera hesitated, looking between Karen and Langford, unsure what to do. Langford turned toward him and said calmly, "You might want to keep that footage. It'll make great evidence when this goes to court." Karen snapped, You can't talk to my staff like that. Langford turned back to her. They're not your staff, they're witnesses, he said coldly. And if you're smart, you'll start cooperating before your own board turns on you. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Finally, Karen broke the silence. Her voice lower now. You think you can ruin me with papers and rumors? She said. You don't know who you're dealing with. I have lawyers, I have power. Langford gave a small, sharp smile. Then I suggest you call them, he said. Because the next time we meet, it won't be at a cabin. It'll be in a courtroom. Her mask cracked, anger and panic flashing across her face. She turned abruptly toward her SUV, shouting at the cameraman. Turn that off. We're leaving. But the man didn't move fast enough, and for a second, the lens caught her face, pale, angry, and shaken. Before she slammed the door and sped off, throwing snow behind her tires, the valley went quiet again. The echo of the engine fading into the distance, Ethan let out a long breath. She's scared? He said. Langford nodded. She should be. Then glanced toward the cabin. I think it's time we show her what real authority looks like. Ethan smiled faintly. About time someone did. They walked back inside, the snow still falling softly outside, covering the fresh tire tracks, the valley returning to its calm surface again. But beneath that calm, the war between one man and a corrupt HOA had just shifted from property lines to the law itself, and this time, Ethan wasn't alone. The next day the air in the valley felt colder. Not because of the snow but because of what was coming. Ethan woke early, his mind already racing, the events of yesterday replaying in his head. Like a movie he couldn't turn off, Karen's face when Langford confronted her. The fear behind her fake smile, the camera catching everything. He knew she wouldn't stay quiet for long. Women like her didn't retreat. They plotted, they sent lawyers, they twisted rules until truth sounded like lies. But this time he was ready. He wasn't the quiet rancher anymore. He was part of something bigger, a storm building behind closed doors, and that morning he planned to make sure every piece of proof was ready before it hit. His small cabin had turned into something like a command post, papers covering the table, folders stacked along the wall. His laptop open showing property maps and legal filings. Across from him, Langford sat calm as ever, flipping through a stack of documents with surgical precision. We've traced her accounts, Langford said quietly. 3 separate bank transfers from HOA funds into her private savings, all labeled as administrative reimbursements. Ethan leaned forward. How much? Langford looked up. $123,000 over 2 years. Ethan whistled under his breath. That's a lot of paint and lawn care. Langford smiled slightly. Too much for any legitimate HOA expense? He closed the file. But what really nails her is this. He pulled another folder from his briefcase and opened it, revealing a printed email thread, black and white, time-stamped and signed. These were sent between Karen and her treasurer, Mrs. Collins. He explained. Here she tells her to adjust dues quietly for selective properties, meaning charge more to homeowners who questioned her authority. Ethan's eyes darkened. So she punished people for speaking up. Langford nodded. Exactly. And that's abuse of position. We can charge her for coercion, maybe even fraud. Ethan rubbed his chin, his voice low. You think she knows we have this? Langford shook his head. Not yet, but she'll sense it soon. People like her can smell when the walls start closing in. As if on cue, Ethan's phone buzzed on the table, an unknown number flashing on the screen. He answered without thinking. Mr. Cole? A woman's voice said, sharp and cold. This is Attorney Monroe, representing the Valley Creek HOA. Ethan smirked slightly. Let me guess, you're calling about yesterday? There was a pause. My client informs me you and an unauthorized state official trespassed and harassed her during a private compliance inspection. Ethan's tone stayed calm. Your client stormed into my home without permission. The woman's voice hardened. You are in violation of community bylaws and have until the end of the week to dismantle your unapproved cabin structure. Ethan laughed. Ma'am, this land doesn't fall under any HOA, he said. And if you're smart, you'll tell your client to start looking for a defense lawyer instead. The silence that followed was sharp. Then the woman said icily, You'll regret this, and hung up. Ethan stared at the phone for a moment, then looked at Langford. "They're starting to panic?" Langford nodded slowly. "Good. Panic makes people sloppy." He opened another file labeled property complaints. Dozens of homeowner statements filled the pages, stories of intimidation, threats, and fake fees. One line read, "She said she'd take my house if I didn't pay." Another, "They added dues for a fence I never built." Ethan shook his head, anger bubbling under the surface. "These people trusted her," he said, "and she used that to scare them." Langford replied, "That's what corruption looks like. Smiles in daylight, claws in the dark." He slid a thick envelope across the table. "Inside are copies of everything we need. Emails, bank trails, property forms. It's all going to the state auditor today." Ethan took the envelope, feeling its weight. "So this is it?" he said quietly. "The beginning of the end for her." Langford nodded once. "Yes, but she'll fight. Expect backlash, fake news, maybe even vandalism. She'll use fear as her weapon again." Ethan smiled faintly. "Let her try." As the hours passed, the cabin turned into a small hive of activity. Langford's assistant arrived with a laptop and a portable scanner, recording every document, every photo, every handwritten note. They worked through lunch, through the afternoon, until the light outside began to fade and the snow turned pink under the sunset. When they finally stopped, Langford leaned back and said, "Tomorrow the warrant will be filed, and once it's approved, we'll freeze her HOA's financial accounts." Ethan looked toward the window where the faint lights of Valley Creek shimmered in the distance. "She won't see it coming," he said quietly, but Langford shook his head. "She'll feel it before it hits. People like her always do." That night, Ethan stood outside his cabin, the cold air biting his face, his breath forming clouds that disappeared into the dark. Down the valley, a few faint headlights glowed near the HOA office. He imagined Karen pacing, yelling into phones, calling emergency meetings, trying to control the narrative. But no amount of shouting could stop what was already in motion. The next morning the news broke. An investigative article appeared online. "State Attorney investigates HOA misconduct in Valley Creek." The post spread like wildfire. Hundreds of comments flooding in from homeowners all over the state sharing their own HOA horror stories. Within hours, cameras started showing up near the Valley Road, reporters waiting for statements, and Ethan knew the calm days were over. As he watched the news van park near his gate, he turned to Langford and said quietly, "You were right. She smells it?" Langford smiled faintly. "Good, because the next knock on her door won't be from you. It'll be from us." In the town below, Karen sat in her office, staring at her phone as messages from board members poured in. Panic, confusion, betrayal. Her hand shook as she reached for her coffee. The same hand that used to sign fines and threats without thought. Now trembling because the power she'd built on fear was crumbling. And somewhere in that valley, Ethan Cole watched the sunrise over his cabin, knowing this was only the beginning of her fall. The day of exposure came faster than anyone expected. The valley that had always been quiet was now buzzing like a hornet's nest. Reporters, investigators, and county officials drove through the winding snowy road toward Valley Creek. The same place that once feared Karen's voice now whispered her name like a warning. Inside her HOA office, Karen sat behind her desk, her perfect hair slightly out of place, her phone buzzing non-stop with messages she didn't want to read. "They're asking questions." One text said, "The Attorney General called the county." Another read, "They're freezing the HOA account." Her hand shook as she scrolled, her confidence from days ago fading like smoke. She stood and looked out the window, the sight that used to give her power. The neat houses, trimmed lawns, and perfect driveways now made her feel trapped, outside. A few residents stood in small groups whispering, pointing toward the office. She could feel their eyes on her, suspicion replacing fear. She turned away from the window muttering, "They don't understand. I built this community. I kept order." But deep down, she knew order wasn't what she'd built. She had built control, and now it was slipping from her hands. Miles away at the cabin, Ethan watched the same scene unfold on a small portable TV. The local news anchor's voice steady and serious. "Breaking news. Valley Creek HOA is under state investigation following allegations of financial misconduct and illegal annexation." Sources confirm the Attorney General's office has filed a preliminary injunction. Ethan leaned back, arms crossed, a faint smile on his face. Langford stood beside him, watching the screen quietly. "It's starting," he said. "Once the papers go public, she's finished." Ethan nodded. "She'll try to fight it?" Langford smirked. "Let her. The louder she screams, the faster she'll bury herself." As if on cue, the TV cut to a live scene outside the HOA office, cameras flashing, Karen walking out in her gray coat, her lips pressed into a thin line, a small crowd waiting for her statement. She stopped, adjusted her hair, and faced the reporters. "These accusations are completely false," she said, her voice firm but forced. "This is a political attack meant to destroy our community. Everything we've done has been by the book." The reporters shouted questions over each other. "Mrs. Phillips, what about the forged annexation signatures? What about the missing funds? What's your response to the Attorney General's investigation?" Her smile trembled, but she kept talking. "We've worked hard to maintain standards. Any mistakes were clerical, not criminal," she said, but her eyes darted nervously toward the cameras, sweat glinting under the winter sun. Langford turned down the volume and said, "There it is, the performance before the fall." Ethan nodded. "You think she'll resign?" Langford shook his head. "Not yet. Pride always fights till the end." That afternoon, Langford's legal team released the first batch of documents to the press. Emails, bank transfers, internal memos, each one connecting Karen to misused funds and fake property claims. The evidence spread online like wildfire. Residents began sharing their own stories, posting screenshots, photos, and letters they'd received from her. One man wrote, "She threatened to fine me $2,000 for painting my fence white." Another woman posted, "She told me my flowers violated the community color code." Within hours, the HOA's official page was flooded with angry comments, demands for her removal, and even threats of lawsuits. Karen's phone rang again. It was her treasurer, Mrs. Collins. Her voice panicked. "Karen, they're questioning me. They came to my house with papers. They have our emails. I didn't sign up for this," Karen shouted. "Don't say a word to them. Deny everything." But Mrs. Collins whispered, "They have proof. I'm not going to jail for you." And the line went dead. Karen slammed the phone down so hard the sound echoed across the office, her breathing quick and uneven. She turned and saw her reflection in the glass window. For the first time, she didn't see power. She saw fear. The kind she used to cause in others now looking back at her. Back at the cabin, Langford's phone buzzed. He checked the message and said quietly, "The treasurer just flipped. She's giving us everything." Ethan grinned. "So it's over?" Langford nodded. "Almost," then looked out the window toward the direction of Valley Creek. "But she doesn't know that yet, and I want her to feel it." By evening, news crews surrounded the HOA building. Police tape marked off the area as auditors carried boxes of files out to waiting vans. Residents watched in disbelief, some angry, some relieved, and others just silent. Karen stepped out once more, trying to speak to the reporters again. But the noise drowned her out, and when she saw the officers walking toward her with a clipboard, her knees nearly buckled. "Mrs. Phillips," the lead investigator said, "we need you to accompany us for." Questioning, she tried to protest. "You can't take me. I'm the president." But he interrupted her calmly. "Not anymore," and the crowd gasped as she was guided toward the unmarked car, cameras flashing, voices shouting her name. But she didn't look up. She just stared straight ahead, the snow falling quietly around her. The same valley that once bowed to her now watched her fall, miles away. Ethan stood outside his cabin under the same snowfall, hands in his jacket pockets, his breath turning to mist. He could almost hear the echoes from town, the end of her reign playing out in real time. He turned to Langford and said softly, "It's over, isn't it?" Langford nodded. "For her, yes. But for the others who helped, this is just the start." He patted the folder under his arm. The exposure was only step one. Ethan looked out toward the dark line of trees separating his land from Valley Creek, the faint sound of wind whistling through the branches. "Then let's finish what we started," he said quietly, and as snow fell thicker over the valley, Two men stood under the cold sky knowing that what began as one HOA's greed had just become a battle that would change the whole county. The night after the public exposure, the valley didn't sleep, lights flickered across houses, phones buzzed with rumors, and every doorstep carried a copy of the morning paper showing Karen Phillips on the front page, her face frozen mid-sentence under the headline, HOA President Understate. Investigation. The power she had built for years shattered overnight, and as her empire of control crumbled, panic replaced pride. Inside her once perfect home, the same woman who once lectured neighbors about mailbox heights sat alone in the dark, her hair messy, her hands trembling as she read through piles of letters and notices, each one demanding answers. Resign immediately. One board member wrote, "The Attorney General called me." Another said, "We're done." She dropped the papers onto the floor, her eyes wild, her voice whispering, "They can't do this to me. I am the HOA." But deep down she knew the truth. The HOA was gone. The board was gone. And all that was left was her, exposed and powerless. Meanwhile, at the cabin, Ethan and Langford sat in the soft glow of the fire, the smell of pine wood thick in the air. The folder that had started everything now lay closed on the table. Its purpose fulfilled, Langford sipped his coffee, his tone calm but serious. "Tomorrow the arrests begin. Collins already signed her statement. The rest will follow, and Karen, well, she'll make noise but not for long." Ethan stared into the flames, his voice steady. "You think she'll go quietly?" Langford shook his head slowly. "People like her never do. They'll claw and scream until the last breath of control slips away. That's when they break." At that very moment, miles away, Karen was sitting in her car outside the HOA office she'd ruled for years. The parking lot was empty, her reserved spot now marked with police tape. Her hands clenched around the steering wheel as her phone buzzed again and again. Messages, calls, demands. She ignored them all until one number appeared. Blocked, yet familiar somehow. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Phillips?" A cold male voice said, "This is Investigator Shaw from the State Attorney's Office. We'd like you to come in voluntarily for questioning tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. She swallowed hard, her voice weak. "If I refuse?" The voice replied without pause. "Then we'll come to you." The line went dead. She screamed, slamming her phone against the dashboard, the sound echoing through the car. The perfect image she'd built cracking further with every breath, her mascara running as tears mixed with rage. "He did this?" she whispered. "That man in the cabin, Ethan Cole, he ruined everything." But her words carried no strength, only fear, as she realized no one was left to listen. The next morning, as the sun rose over the snow, reporters gathered again outside the county courthouse, cameras flashing as the state cars arrived. Ethan and Langford stepped out first, their expressions steady, businesslike, the crowd whispering, pointing, recognizing them from the news. And then came Karen's vehicle, pulling up fast and stopping with a screech. She stepped out wearing a black coat, sunglasses hiding her swollen eyes, trying to look strong but her hands shaking as she adjusted her hair. She walked through the crowd with her head high, pretending not to hear the questions shouted at her. "Did you steal from the HOA funds? Are you resigning? Will you plead guilty?" She said nothing, her jaw tight, but when she saw Ethan standing near the courthouse steps, her steps faltered. Her mask slipped for just a moment, the memory of the cabin flashing in her mind. The firelight, the papers, the Attorney General's cold stare. She hated that image, it haunted her, and as she passed by, Ethan looked at her quietly, no anger, no pride, just calm. That made it worse. She wanted him to fight, to yell, to show hate, but he didn't, and that silence broke her more than any word could. Inside the courthouse, the air was tense, cameras flashing as the session began. Langford presented the files formally to the state clerk, each document stamped and sealed. Karen sat across the table, her lawyer whispering urgently, but she wasn't listening. She stared at Ethan across the room, the man who had lived quietly in the valley while she ruled like a queen. Now sitting there as the reason her throne burned to ashes, the judge read through the charges. Fraud, forgery, property intimidation, misuse of public funds. The list sounded endless, every word slicing another piece off her pride. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Mrs. Phillips, Do you understand the charges against you? She nodded stiffly, her voice cracking. Yes. Outside, the news spread like wildfire again, and by evening, every homeowner in Valley Creek had seen the image of their former president walking out of the courthouse under escort, her face hidden, her once proud shoulders slumped. Some cheered, others simply shook their heads. The woman who had ruled their lives with fear was gone. At the cabin that evening, Ethan stood by the porch, the valley bathed in orange light from the sunset, the air finally calm again. He could hear the faint hum of reporters packing up in the distance, their voices fading. Langford joined him, holding the newspaper that bore the headline, HOA President Faces Felony Charges. Community free at last. He handed it to Ethan and said quietly, "It's over." Ethan took it, glanced at the picture of Karen being led away, and said softly, "No, it's finished for her. But for the people she hurt, it's just the start of healing." The wind carried his words down the valley, where the snow began to melt, revealing the earth beneath, life returning to a place that had forgotten what peace sounded like. In town, the HOA office lights went dark for good, the sign on the door replaced with a simple notice, "Closed by order of the state attorney general." Karen sat alone in her home that night, staring at the same notice pinned to her own gate. The house that once glowed with pride now dark and silent, the ticking of the clock echoing in the emptiness. She whispered to herself, "They'll forget me." But she knew the valley never would, not for the rules, not for the control, but for the moment she burst into a cabin uninvited, and met the man who ended her reign with nothing more than truth. Days turned into weeks, and the valley that once feared. Karen Phillips slowly began to breathe again. The headlines that once carried her name now spoke of reform and rebuilding. The Valley Creek HOA was under complete state control, every account audited, every rulebook rewritten. The board members who had once followed her orders like loyal soldiers were now lining up to testify against her. One by one, they came forward with statements, confessions, and stories that painted a picture worse than anyone had imagined. The misuse of funds was only the surface. Beneath it lay years of threats, blackmail, and secret deals made in Karen's name. The people who had once trembled when she knocked on their doors were now speaking freely, their voices stronger with every passing day, and for the first time in years, the community began to feel like a neighborhood again. Not a dictatorship. Ethan watched it all unfold quietly from his cabin. The snow outside melting into soft streams that ran through the fields, life returning to the land as though the valley itself was healing. Every morning he'd sit on his porch with a cup of coffee. The same cup he held during the worst days, only now the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy anymore, it was peaceful, earned. A calm born from victory and justice. Langford visited often, no longer with folders and files, but with updates and the occasional smile. "She pleaded guilty," he said one afternoon, the fire crackling softly behind him. 3 years minimum, maybe 5 if the judge pushes for full restitution. Ethan didn't smile or cheer, he just nodded slowly, his voice calm. "I didn't want her in prison. I just wanted her gone." Langford understood. "She's more than gone, Ethan. She's erased," he said. "Her name is poison now. No one will ever let her near a board again." Ethan looked out the window, the sun glinting on the lake. "Good," he said. "Maybe now people will stop fearing those who pretend to have power." Meanwhile, in town, the new HOA president, a quiet man named Leonard Hayes, stood on the community stage addressing the residents, his voice clear and honest. "No more hidden fees, no more threats," he said. "Our job is to serve, not control." The crowd clapped softly, relief showing on their faces. A few even smiled for the first time in years, the weight Karen had placed on their shoulders finally lifting. Among them were families who had almost lost their homes, older couples who had been bullied into paying fake dues, and young couples who had been fined for things as small as keeping chickens or painting their fences. Now they laughed about it, sharing stories instead of whispers, freedom replacing fear. Back at the cabin, Ethan received a letter sealed with the state emblem. Inside was a simple note from Langford's office. "On behalf of the State Attorney General, we thank you for your cooperation and courage. Your evidence was instrumental in restoring justice to the Valley Creek community." Below it was a handwritten line from Langford himself. "Enjoy your peace, you earned it." Ethan folded the letter gently and placed it in the drawer where the first HOA threat letters once sat. A silent reminder of how far things had come. That night the sky over the valley was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the black. The air crisp and quiet. Ethan sat by the fire pit outside, the crackle of flames the only sound, his dogs lying near his feet. He thought of everything that had happened, the letters, the confrontations, the hearings, the headlines, and how all of it had started because one woman believed she was untouchable. He smiled faintly, not with pride but with peace, because justice didn't come from anger. It came from patience and truth. Far away, in a different town, Karen sat in a small rented apartment, the walls bare, the windows covered with cheap curtains, her once perfect nails chipped, her hair dull. She watched a news report replaying the same footage of her being escorted from the courthouse, the same clip that had ended her reign. She reached forward and turned off the TV, the screen going dark, the silence loud enough to hurt. She whispered softly, "They'll forget me." But deep down, she knew they never would. Her name had become a warning, a story told in every HOA meeting across the county. A reminder of what happens when power is used for fear instead of fairness. Back in the valley, the night deepened, the stars reflecting off the calm lake. Ethan tossed another log onto the fire, the sparks rising into the cold air and, disappearing, he took a deep breath, feeling the peace he had fought for finally settle around him. He whispered to himself, "It's over." And for the first time, it truly was. No more knocking on the door, no more threats, no more fear, just silence. The kind that belonged to freedom, not isolation. And as the wind swept softly through the trees, the valley seemed to whisper back, carrying his words across the hills that once echoed with Karen's voice, but now only knew the sound of peace. Months passed and the valley turned green again. The snow melted from the mountain tops, and the lake reflected the blue sky like a mirror. Peace had returned. Not the fragile kind that breaks when people whisper, but the real kind. The kind that grows quietly after a storm. Ethan's cabin stood as it always had, solid and calm. The same wood walls that had once heard shouting and threats now heard only the soft hum of the wind. Birds sang outside, and the air smelled of pine and earth. He spent his mornings on the porch watching the mist rise off the water, a mug of coffee in his hands, a faint smile on his face. Sometimes he still thought about Karen. Not with anger but with disbelief. How someone could destroy so much just to feel powerful. He didn't hate her anymore. He pitied her, because he understood now that people like her never really had peace. They were too busy fighting shadows of their own making. One afternoon, Langford returned to the valley for the last time, no longer in his formal suit but in a simple jacket. He walked up the gravel path to Ethan's porch and handed him a brown envelope. "It's official," he said, his voice calm but satisfied. "The Valley Creek HOA is dissolved permanently. New laws are being written so this never happens again." Ethan took the envelope, the seal from the state printed in gold. "So it's done," he said quietly. Langford nodded. "Completely. The funds you helped recover will be returned to the homeowners. The valley is free." Ethan smiled faintly. "You did good work," he said. But Langford shook his head. "No, you did. I just helped push it across the line." They sat for a while, listening to the wind, watching the sunlight dance across the lake. No words were needed. After some time, Langford stood, adjusting his jacket. "You staying out here for good?" Ethan looked at the trees, the hills, the cabin he had built with his own hands. "Yeah," he said softly. "This place finally feels like home." Langford smiled and nodded. "Then I'll leave you to it." He extended his hand. Ethan shook it firmly. "Thank you," Ethan said. Langford gave a small grin. "Just don't call me next time another Karen shows up." And they both laughed, the kind of laugh that carries the weight of everything they'd survived. When Langford drove away, his car disappearing down the long winding road, Ethan stood alone on his porch for a long while, the sound of tires fading until only the rustle of the trees remained. That evening, he lit a small fire by the lake, the flames reflecting on the still water. He pulled out the old folder, the one that started it all, and opened it one last time. The papers inside were yellowed at the edges, some folded, some torn, but all of them marked with the fight that had freed the valley. He stared at them for a long moment, then smiled and threw them into the fire. The The flames caught instantly, curling the paper and turning it to ash. Sparks drifted upward into the night sky. Joining the stars, he whispered to himself, "It's over." But this time, the words didn't sound like relief. They sounded like peace, the kind that stays. Down the road, Valley Creek was changing. Children played in yards that used to be restricted. Neighbors talked across fences again. Laughter replaced complaints, and for the first time in years, no one feared the knock-on. The door, the HOA office, had been turned into a small library, its shelves filled with books donated by the same families Karen once fined for leaving lawn chairs outside. On the wall hung a framed quote that Leonard Hayes, the new leader, had chosen himself. "Community means respect, not control." Ethan visited once in a while, quietly, never asking for credit, just smiling as he saw how alive the place had become. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the lake shimmered gold, he stood by the water, the same spot where Karen had once shouted at him, and watched a family fishing off the dock, the laughter of their kids echoing through the valley. He smiled softly, took a deep breath, and walked back to his cabin, the smell of smoke and pine filling the air, the last light of the day fading into a calm darkness. Somewhere, miles away, Karen sat in a small community service office, signing documents as part of her sentence. Her world smaller now, her voice quieter. She looked out the window at a group of people working together, planting trees by the roadside, and for a brief second, even she wondered what it might have felt like to build something honest. But that thought passed quickly, leaving only silence. Back in the valley, the stars came out again, reflecting. On the still lake, Ethan leaned back in his chair, the night calm and endless, his cabin glowing softly under the moonlight. The story that had begun with an angry knock on the door had ended with peace in every corner of the valley, and as the wind carried the sound of the water against the shore, it whispered through the trees. A quiet reminder that justice, once found, never truly leaves.